The chilling discovery. Family trapped for 9 years in secret room. What really happened? Hook. What would you do if you discovered a family trapped for 9 years in a house no one dared enter? A house with a dark secret that even the bravest couldn't escape. Stay tuned to find out the shocking truth. But be warned, once you step inside, you might never leave. A family had disappeared without a trace. No one knew where they had gone. Neighbors said they vanished overnight. The police searched, but there were no clues. It was as if they had just disappeared. Years passed. The house stood empty, abandoned. Until one day, a team of workers entered the house. The owners had sold it. They were going to clear out the old furniture. The first sign of something wrong came when they noticed the door. A door hidden behind a faded wall. A door that no one had ever seen before. It was old, rusty, but it had a lock. They were curious. What was behind it? What was hidden there? They tried to open the door. At first, it wouldn't budge. They used tools to pry it open. Finally, with a creak, the door gave way. The air inside the room was thick. It smelled stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. And then they saw them. The family that had vanished. They were sitting in a corner, silent, their eyes wide with fear. Unblinking. There was no sound in the room, no movement. It was as if time had stopped. The workers froze. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. The family had been trapped in this secret room for 9 years. But how? They looked around. The room was small, empty except for the family and a few old blankets. A faint noise echoed in the distance. A tapping sound, but it was too faint to understand. One worker stepped forward. He called out, "Are you all right?" But the family didn't respond. They just stared, their faces pale, their expressions frozen. The room seemed colder now. The air felt heavier. Something wasn't right. They had been here for so long, but what had kept them here? It didn't make sense. Why had no one noticed? A chill ran down the worker's spine, and then he saw it. On the wall, a message, written in faint, trembling letters. It said, "Help us." The worker's heart raced. His eyes locked on the words. The message was clear, but its meaning was not. He reached for his phone, hands shaking. He dialed the police, his voice cracking. "There's a family here. They're trapped. I don't know how." But even as he spoke, he felt something strange. The air grew colder, more suffocating. The silence around him pressed in, thick and unrelenting. The family did not move. They didn't blink, didn't breathe. It was as if they weren't even alive. The worker stepped back, his mind racing. Where were the signs of struggle? Why weren't they speaking? Had they been here all this time? Just waiting? His gaze swept across the room again. And then he noticed something else. There was a small, old-fashioned lamp in the corner. Its light flickered weakly, as if barely clinging to life. It cast long shadows across the walls. Shadows that seemed to move. He took a deep breath and stepped closer to the family. The closer he got, the more unsettling it became. The mother sat on the floor, her eyes wide, yet vacant. The father stood behind her, his face pale and unmoving. The children were silent, their faces gaunt. He reached out, unsure what to do. But as his fingers brushed the mother's shoulder, he felt a jolt of electricity shoot through him. He pulled his hand back quickly. Something was terribly wrong. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. The family's eyes, they followed his every move. But they still said nothing, not a word. The worker stumbled backward, his pulse racing. He couldn't take it anymore. He turned and ran from the room, slamming the door shut behind him. His breath was ragged as he stumbled into the hallway. What had just happened? How had this family been trapped for 9 years, and why did they look so different? The police arrived moments later, but the room was empty. The door was locked again, and the family was gone. There was no sign of them anywhere in the house. The workers swore they had seen them, but when the officers searched, nothing remained. Only the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. The family was gone, and the truth was more terrifying than anyone could imagine. The officers searched the entire house. They went through every room, every corner, but there was no trace of the family, not even a footprint. The only thing that remained was that strange door. It was still locked, but something felt off. The air around the house felt thick, like it was holding a secret. One of the officers approached the door again. His hand hovered over the rusted handle. He hesitated. There was something unnerving about it, something he couldn't explain, but then he turned the handle. It opened with an unnatural ease. It was as though the door had never been locked. He stepped inside. The room was empty, completely barren. No furniture, no family. Just cold, damp walls. The officer felt a strange sensation wash over him, a chill creeping up his spine. It felt like something was watching him, but there was no one there. He looked around, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He tried to shake off the feeling, but something caught his eye. On the wall, a faint, almost invisible mark. He leaned in closer. It was a symbol he had seen before in old folklore, a symbol of a curse. His heart raced. This couldn't be real. It had to be a coincidence, but the longer he stared at the symbol, the more he felt its presence, like it was drawing him in, calling him. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. The officer shivered. Then, a low whisper echoed through the walls. It was barely audible, a soft voice, almost like a sigh. "Help us." The officer froze. He turned, but no one was behind him. His breath caught in his throat. There was no way that voice could have come from anywhere. He backed out of the room. The door slammed shut behind him. The officers outside had heard it too. The whisper, the eerie, chilling whisper. They exchanged worried looks. None of them wanted to go back in there, but they had to. They had to find out what had happened. The family couldn't just disappear, could they? They gathered their courage and entered again. But this time, the room was different. The walls were no longer bare. There were strange markings everywhere, as if the walls had been written on. The officer's hands trembled as he looked closer. They were names he didn't recognize. And then, right in the center of the wall, there was another message. "Don't open the door." His mind raced. What had he done? He had opened it. He had let them in. The room felt colder now. The whispers grew louder, more voices overlapping. A chorus of desperate pleas. "Help us. Please don't leave." Behind the door, his hands shook. He couldn't breathe. He turned to the other officers, but their faces were pale. They hadn't heard the voices. They didn't hear anything. The officer felt like he was losing his grip on reality. What was happening? The shadows in the room seemed to shift. They stretched toward him. He could feel them tugging at him. He stepped back, his eyes wide. What was this place? Was it even real? He reached for the door, his fingers trembling. He needed to get out. He needed to leave. But as he touched the handle, he heard something, a sound, a low, guttural growl. It came from behind the door, from the other side. His heart pounded. He turned the handle quickly, pulling it open. And there, in the darkness beyond, he saw something move, a figure, a shape. But it wasn't human. It was twisted, distorted. It stepped forward, its eyes glowing in the dark. The officer's legs went weak. He stumbled backward, his heart racing. The figure took another step, closer. It was like it was made of shadows, its body flickering in and out of existence. The officer couldn't scream. He was frozen, paralyzed by fear. And then, just as the figure lunged toward him, Everything went black. The other officers rushed in, but they found only darkness. The room was empty. The officer who had opened the door was gone. The door still wide open. And the whispers, they were gone. The house fell silent, and the mystery remained. The silence in the house was deafening. Not a single sound could be heard. No whispers, no growls, nothing. The officers stood frozen at the doorway, their breaths shallow, their minds reeling. What had they just witnessed? They searched the room again, but there was no sign of the officer. No sign of the twisted figure. Nothing but empty air. A sense of dread hung over them. It felt as if the house itself was alive, watching them. One officer turned to the others. His voice was shaky. "We have to leave now." But before they could move, a strange noise echoed from the floor above. A low creak. A door opening. They froze. They couldn't tell if it was the wind or something else. The officer who had spoken earlier swallowed hard. He motioned for them to follow him. They made their way toward the stairs. Every step felt heavier than the last. The air seemed to thicken as they climbed. The temperature dropped further with every step. They reached the top of the stairs, but what they saw, they were not prepared for it. At the end of the hallway, there was a light coming from under a door, a flickering, unnatural light. It beckoned them. Drawn to it, they moved closer. The door creaked open on its own. A gust of cold air rushed out, hitting them like a slap. They stepped inside. The room was unlike anything they had seen before. It was large, almost cathedral-like. The walls were covered in strange symbols, symbols that seemed to pulse, alive. At the center of the room, there was an altar, a stone slab, dark and ancient, and standing over it, there was the family. They were not the same. Their eyes were hollow, their bodies frail, decayed, and around them were the same twisted shadows, the figures that had haunted the room below. The family was performing some sort of ritual. The air around them crackled with energy. The officer stepped forward, his heart hammering. What is this?" he stammered. The mother turned to him. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes, those empty eyes, locked onto his. And then the shadows began to move. They writhed, reaching out toward the officers. The officer backed away, but it was too late. The shadows surrounded them, cold, unyielding. One officer screamed. The others fell to their knees. The shadows were suffocating them, and just before they lost consciousness, a single voice whispered in their ears, "Welcome to the endless waiting." And then everything went dark. The darkness was suffocating. No light, no sound, just an overwhelming void. The officers couldn't move. Their bodies felt heavy, trapped. They tried to scream, but their voices were gone. The shadows pressed in, thick and unrelenting. It was as though the very walls were closing in on them. But then there was a faint glow, a pulse of light. It was the same flickering light from before. The altar, the ritual. The officers' eyes slowly adjusted. They could see again, but they weren't in the room. They were somewhere else, a place different. The air was thick with the scent of decay. The ground was hard, stone beneath them. They looked around, disoriented. Where were they? What had happened? The shadows were gone, but in their place there were whispers, soft, distant, like voices carried by the wind. The officers stood up, slowly trembling. They were no longer in the house. They were in a vast, empty expanse. The sky above them was black. Stars flickered, distant and cold, and the earth beneath them was cracked and lifeless. In the distance, they could see something, a figure, a shadow. It moved toward them. The officers felt the air grow colder with each step. They didn't want to turn, but they had no choice. The figure came closer. It was the family, but they weren't alive. Not anymore. Their eyes glowed faintly, empty and hollow. Their bodies were twisted, contorted, like they were caught between life and death. The officer who had tried to speak earlier stepped back. He felt an icy hand on his shoulder. He whirled around, but no one was there. And then the voice came again. The same whisper from before. "Join us." The officer's heart raced. He tried to speak, to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The family moved closer, their faces twisted in agony, and then they stopped. Just inches away, their eyes locked onto his, and he understood. This place, this void, was their prison, the one they could never escape. The officer gasped. He didn't want to be part of it. He didn't want to be trapped here like them. But before he could move, the shadows returned. They surrounded him. The cold was unbearable, the whispers deafening, and then everything went black again. The family had waited, and now they had someone new to join them. The officer's mind spun in endless darkness. It felt like time had stopped, like he was floating in a place outside of reality. The cold was unbearable. It seeped into his bones, gripping him with a chilling, suffocating force. Then a voice cut through the darkness. A soft whisper, barely audible. "Wake up." The officer's eyelids flickered. He tried to move, but his body was heavy. He was trapped. But then he opened his eyes. The room was familiar. The altar, the strange symbols on the walls, the shadows. He was back. But something was wrong. The room was different, more alive, more real. The family stood before him, their eyes locked onto his. They were no longer twisted shadows, but human once again, or something close to it. They were waiting, and in their eyes was something he couldn't understand, something ancient. The mother's mouth opened, but the words that came out were like a song, soft and haunting. "Now you know. You are one of us." The officer felt his heart race. He didn't understand. What did she mean? Before he could move, the walls began to pulse. The air shimmered with an unnatural energy, and then the floor beneath him cracked open. A deep, hollow sound that echoed through the room. The officer stumbled back, but the shadows reached out, grabbing his legs. He couldn't escape. The darkness was everywhere. It swallowed him whole. The last thing he heard was the family's laughter, soft and cold. The same whispers, the same promise. "Welcome to the waiting." The room was silent again, and the door, once opened, was now sealed shut. The family had claimed another, and house, it waited.